Hello everybody and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here and I'm joined by Don as usual. Today we have a very special guest, Freddy, and I guess it's Wise Executor on Twitter that you may know him by. And we're going to be talking about Jesus. He was watching or listening to this BBC program and evoked some thoughts that he wanted to discuss, and it seemed pretty interesting to me, so we decided to have him on to talk about it. So we're going to be talking about Jesus and suffering and justice and the position of Jesus in Christianity and Islam and how they're maybe similar, maybe different. We'll see.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey Fred, how's it going?
Not too bad. Talking about Jesus always makes me feel like I'm on the precipice of saying something extremely stupid.
I know the feeling. Just the name alone, it kind of evokes like you better say something serious and real, or just shut up.
Because it's not just that a lot of very serious sort of theology and philosophy and history has been written about him, but there's an endless supply of just pure nonsense.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's I think a certain amount of reverence is necessary and humility. But nevertheless, I'm going to say some pretty stupid things about him, probably. But I'll phrase them as questions, so it's okay.
Sure.
So yeah, I guess the thing that got me thinking about Jesus, particularly in relation to Islam, was I was listening to a BBC show with a former Moroccan army officer who participated in an unsuccessful coup in 1971 or 1972. I think there were 4 or 5 coups within a decade that happened in Morocco, and I can't remember exactly which one it was, but there were the leaders of the coup were executed by the king, and a lot of the junior officers who took part were put in. I don't think they were even sentenced, they just ended up in prison. And the person who was being interviewed, a man named Aziz bin, was talking to a BBC journalist who'd been imprisoned in Beirut and had not 18 years. So Aziz was in prison for 18 years. I don't know how long the journalist he was speaking to. I don't know how long he was imprisoned, but it was the idea was that, it was a shared experience. But the experience that this Moroccan officer described was extremely when you listen to something, when you hear about something extreme. I mean, the idea of being in prison for 18 years it's hard to imagine. It's very, very, very bad, but an experience like that transforms you in a way that I don't know if someone who hasn't experienced could understand. Obviously, the human mind in a situation like that can just absolutely go to pieces. And he was explaining that some of his fellow prisoners, a couple of them had memorized the Quran, and they would keep their mind sharp by reciting it and teaching it to each other. And I suppose this comes from a tradition I don't know very much about, but I people who memorize the Quran, is that a sort of an established tradition?
Oh yeah, they're called Hafez, and it's actually relatively common, like much more so than you'd think, especially like children who have a traditional Islamic education. They will have the Quran memorized by the time they're 16, 17, 18. And then often they will, if they continue on with like a religious education, that they'll just, constantly be studying it and revising and stuff. So that will kind of stay with them.
And I just remembered that I heard it suggested that one of the reasons I'm not saying it's not easy to memorize the Quran, but one of the things that facilitates its memorization is that the Arabic, I guess classical Arabic, that it's composed in is very pleasant, or it has a sort of a rhythmic quality, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, what's funny is the in the Quran itself, it actually says that God says we have made this easy to memorize.
God is very practical.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
would sing it generally, right? Like, is that how you would memorize it? You would sing it?
Well, we wouldn't say that we're singing it. We would
Sure.
say we're reciting it.
Okay.
But
But it's
yeah,
like,
there is a musicality to the recitation. There's a particular kind of, I'm not sure, I don't have the words for this, but like you know, you have to say certain parts in a certain way. You extend certain syllables. There's a kind of a tonality that's like established as the standard. There's a few different like modes of recitation. I believe 7 modes, and they, you know, it's the same text. It's not like they have different ideas about what the content is, but certain things are just done differently, and it tends to be kind of regionalized.
mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, I suppose so. When it was being memorized by these prisoners, it wouldn't have just been. I guess it's wrong to say it was just memorization, because it had all those other aspects you just mentioned as well. Because when he said that it kept his mind sharp, that can't have just been, you know, I mean, one form of memorizing and reciting is the memorization and reciting that you do when you're just sort of parroting something out. But if you're keeping your mind sharp, it implies a deeper engagement. So
Yeah, I imagine so.
Yeah, it was
It's
interesting.
a little bit different than like just digits of pi or something. You know,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
there's
yeah.
things to ruminate on. And one thing that's interesting about the Quran is that there's a lot of like refrain, and it's almost like referencing itself at times. Actually, the vocabulary in the Quran, there's you don't need a very large vocabulary to be able to just memorize it all. So like people who don't actually speak Arabic have been able to memorize it fairly easily, considering the task, because there's just so much repetition in terms of the certain words and phrases and things like that that are used. And that has an interesting effect where you have one verse, because of just the fact that it's so similar to many other verses, it kind of creates these connections between them that you might not otherwise sort of have.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, so yeah, there's a lot to think about, I guess, when you're reciting.
Yeah, well, it's I mean, that fact alone interested me. But of course, what we're saying and what we're reciting, if we're thinking about it, obviously shapes your thought. I mean, I think that's I think a basic materialist principle that we can take as axiomatically true. And
Sure.
uh, when he was talking about it, he mentioned that there were other people whose minds started to just completely go. And every so often, I don't quite know how many other people were in prison with them, but they had a way of communicating with each other, obviously, or otherwise they wouldn't have been learning the Quran. But he talked about a few hearing people mentally break down, and he said that actually being in prison heightened his hearing, because they would tell
Hmm.
what time of day it was based on birds that were singing, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But so as well as memorizing the Quran, the other thing he said, which sustained him, was that he would have religious dreams. And he said that most of his dreams were about Moses. He would have long conversations with Moses, and he didn't really say, he didn't explain what any of those dreams were. Unfortunately, I would have loved to have heard them. But he said, apart from Moses, the dream that he remembers most vividly was a dream about Jesus, who said, and I don't want to, I feel like if I misremember it, I'm doing a disservice to him, and possibly to Jesus if he was actually visited by him. But it was something along the lines of being able to find heaven and in hell. And he didn't say he was comforted by this. I guess the implication may have been that he was, but I don't know if it was comforting exactly. The way it sustained him is something that I was interested in, and you didn't really. I wasn't exactly sure what effect it had on him, but it was clearly important to him that he spoke to Jesus, who visited him in his dream in a halo. And I know that Jesus is important in Islam, so it's not odd that someone who was in the process of memorizing the Quran and sustaining themselves in this very horrible condition would have dreamed about Jesus. But it seemed to me that one of the reasons that he might have remembered this one most vividly is that in Muslim and Christian tradition, there is, I think, clear associations of with suffering, and that this is obviously a different significance in Christianity, where Jesus' suffering is symbolic. You know, it symbolizes the taking on the sins of the world, suffering for us. I was just wondering if the figure of Jesus had a similar significance in Islam, or what that significance was, if it was something else.
Yeah. Yeah, the stuff you were saying there is kind of interesting to me. There's a few things that popped in my head, but I'll answer your question first. So there is, I would say that Jesus does have a kind of association with suffering in Islam as well, as he does in Christianity, but it's much less central. It's much less, because one thing about the prophets in general is that they all have this association with suffering, because they are, they're like righteous servants of God. They're leading people against, evils in the world and this kind of stuff, and they're suffering because of it. And there's an idea that the people who God loves most are the ones that he tries the most. And so the prophets are seen as having the most difficult trials, and so thereby experiencing the most suffering as well. So I would say that, like, there is an emphasis on the suffering of Jesus as being like a big part of his, what makes him stand out, I guess. But on the other hand, it's also true that that suffering is just shared, and it's more distributed across all of the kind of major prophets that are spoken about in the Quran and whatnot as well. So it's definitely less central than it is in Christianity. But yeah, so just to before I forget, when you said that he was dreaming of Moses and Jesus, but mostly Moses, it kind of just reminded me that the prophets that are mentioned the most in the Quran, first it's Abraham, but I think Moses is second, and then Jesus is third. So there may be some element there where if he's really heavily, focused on the Quran, reciting the Quran a lot, that kind of thing, that he's thinking about these people a lot, and so they are starting to appear in his dreams.
Right. Well,
that kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah, that would sort of undermine the nice thought I had, which was, well, he dreamed of Jesus because he was suffering, but it could also just be because he was talking about Jesus.
Well, they can be both.
But the death of the author, it's
sure.
My interpretation is just as as valid as anything else.
Yeah.
Sure.
What about Don? You've been your relationship with Christianity has been one of rediscovery, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's how did you? I mean, is your how do you see Jesus as a figure in Christianity? I mean, did my suggestion that it was he's a figure who's significant in part because he suffered, did that resonate? Or
yeah, and actually, I mean, this is kind of a cheat, but I want to sort of answer your question with a question for Tom, which is so in Christianity, one of the big things obviously is that there's like this trans-historical aspect of Jesus' suffering, kind of like he's taking on sins from other people. Like he experiences them directly himself. Is that something that happens in Islam too, or is it just his own ministry kind of thing? Is it like his historical ministry that he kind of follows around? Like he's wandering around preaching to people and stuff, and then he gets sort of like persecuted and then sentenced to death at least. And in that process, is there like a personal experience of his where he's taking on other people's suffering, or is that just not part of Islam?
Yeah, so that's a very key difference, and so no, that's not part of the Islamic narrative. Like, just for maybe people don't know, but the crucifixion is often just outright denied by Muslims. It's sort of like a debatable question. It's somewhat ambiguous in the Quran what exactly occurred, but it is kind of outright stated that there was some kind of, if not deception, but almost like an illusion or something that appeared in a way that was not really the reality of what was going on there. So again, it's not clear what in fact occurred. Clearly, Jesus is seen as someone who was persecuted, but the idea of carrying others' sins and that kind of stuff is actually, that's another thing that's just flat out denied, not specifically in regard to Jesus, but just in a general sense that in the Quran, there's a line that says something along the lines of like no person will will be burdened with the sins of another. And so that's taken as like a theological point, which I think is just a little bit of a, it's just because of the rivalry, so to speak, between Christianity and Islam that this has become, I think, a little bit more of like a pointed issue where it's like, no, this is explicitly denied in the Quran. It's not like laid out that way in the Quran, I would say, but it's kind of taken in that sense where it's just like, this is something that we've been told by God cannot happen. And so this is like a, just a point of contention or something. I don't necessarily take it to mean, like, I don't believe that Jesus took on other people's sins, but I also don't think it's like some kind of big,
sure,
some kind of big debate or something to have.
But like, so in this situation of a person being in prison and then experiencing some sort of sympathy for the sufferings of Jesus and sort of, is that what, like, the sufferings would be the trials of Jesus during his life on earth?
Yeah, exactly. So he's kind of viewed as someone who, I don't know what the word is, but just like that he bore suffering, like great suffering, and refused to kind of give in and achieve no like worldly gain from any of his preaching and all that. Like he didn't rise to any position of power or anything like that. And so that's what I think characterizes Jesus in Islam. There's much less focus on this idea of the suffering in terms of like taking on sins or anything like that. That's pretty much just pushed to the side, and it's much more about, here's a person who spoke the truth, led people to the truth, and was just persecuted by the powers that be for it.
So just to be clear, you don't think Jesus was God?
No.
Sorry, I probably shouldn't be flippant about that kind of thing. For what it's worth, I don't really understand the Trinity anyway. So, but actually, the point you said before about aspects of Islamic thought negotiating, I guess what you could call a political or ideological battle with Christianity and Judaism. I've become a little bit, I don't really know anything about it, but I've become a bit, interested in that more recently. I suppose the biggest issue there was the suggestion that belief in the Trinity was somehow covert paganism, or was outright paganism.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of a very lowbrow, cheap shot that is just easy to digest for people. Like it's almost like a meme. It's very easy to kind of spread this idea that like, oh, they have the Trinity, that means they believe in three gods, and that's like an easy, like, you don't have to get into actual theological debates. You can just like know that about Christians, and then you can dismiss them as like, just pagans or whatever. I feel like it's a little bit unfortunate that is so common, but I think that's just how these things go. We have billions of people. You kind of have to find the lowest common denominator things to explain stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything necessarily. I mean, I don't think that the arguments were very, very good. I don't know if there's anything sort of debased about it. It's just a kind of it's a way of talking that emerges in any intellectual tradition. I guess there'll be more sophisticated and less sophisticated points. But I do remember I can't remember an English historian I can't remember her name, but she was talking about early Christianity and how it managed to be, how it became so successful, and she actually said one of the reasons that's sometimes given for why it was easy to persuade former pagans to adopt Christianity is that the idea of the Trinity made it easier for them to give up their old gods. If you're unwilling to give up a god for a household god, and then a god for business and that kind of thing, the idea that there's a trinity makes it easier for pagans to make that move. And obviously the function in an explanation for how Christianity succeeded is different to the theological debate, but I just thought it was funny that criticism was being used in that historical context.
I feel like maybe the opposite is true a lot of the time too, where a lot of sort of peripheral Christianities, like people sort of converting on the fringes, a lot of those tended to be people that didn't believe in the Trinity. Like it was like a conversion where they would believe that Jesus was just a simple man, or it would be like the opposite, where it would like, or somewhat similar, where like Jesus was some sort of superpowered person or something. And, it was that process over time of consolidation of theology and sort of imperial power and stuff that, got rid of a lot of those kind of things. But I think that, in some ways it's kind of funny that, like there was that process where there were a lot of people that were new converts who thought of it more as just Jesus as like a sort of culminating prophet or something. So, yeah.
When you said like a guy imagining him as like a superpowered man, I kind of pictured like some Roman citizen in Palestine or whatever with the toga on and everything. He's like doing the soy face because he's like all into superheroes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is funny because that, when I was more less of a believer in these things, like that's what it came across to me. A lot of it is like just people being like, because a lot of the stuff that's in the Bible is stuff like Jesus healing random people or something like that, and it just all seemed like it was some superpower guy going around. It was like Marvel comics for people that were mostly illiterate or something. So yeah.
It reminds me of one of my favorite King of the Hill episodes where Bobby has to talk about a bit from the Bible for Sunday school, and he's been going to these magician shows with his parents, and he's getting really into magic, and so he decides to talk about Jesus turning water into wine, and the way of he presented it was like he was announcing a magician show, and he's like, next up, the amazing Jesus is going to turn water into wine. And everyone in the audience just, it's like he had no idea why he'd done something wrong, which is what I liked about because it's religion, these religious ideas, they do have to be, that there's something sort of like demonic or devilish in magic. They're not things that you just naturally think. It's the way religious ideas sort of accumulate. You get some very weird things in the course of their development.
Sure. Yeah, miracles in general, like just as a concept, has always been a little bit difficult for me to grasp exactly how to square that with like monotheism and sort of the overall point of it. It kind of seems odd. I don't know. I mean, one thing that's said in Islam about miracles is that they were used to demonstrate to people like the validity of a prophet's claim to prophethood, that God would sort of like do this to aid people in their belief. Mm-hmm. And there's even a passage in the Quran where, I'm forgetting if it's Moses or Abraham now. I think it's Abraham. He asks God to perform. Asking God to perform miracles is kind of maybe not the right terminology, but basically he asked God to aid him in his faith, to kind of strengthen his faith and to do certain things that will kind of show like his power and kind of like, because he's going from, like, he says that he looks to the moon and realizes that the moon kind of like rises and falls, and he looks to the sun and the sun rises and falls. He looks to all these things to kind of identify what's the power in this world, like what really is it, and then realizes it's God, and then he asks God to do these, show him things, show me that you're powerful, not out of disbelief, but out of a desire to like strengthen his faith and to give him the strength to be the prophet he needs to be, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the Wittgenstein has a really interesting comment about miracle. I mean, I don't know how much I go along with it, but he was talking about how a miracle things appear miraculous. And I think in the context of this philosophy, he's trying to understand the forms of human life where the word miracle has meaning. Which you know, I don't know how clear that idea is, but I mean, maybe it gives, you know, he's wanting to look at how words are used in different contexts, basically, and I suspect this is what motivates his observation. But he was talking about how, you know, if someone who seemed saintly was talking, and then the wind blew the branches of the trees, it would almost look as if the person talking was moving, you know, the branches of the tree themselves, and it would seem like a miracle. You'd want to quote, but there's a naturalistic explanation, of course, but it's the conjunction of two things that seem meaningful. But of course, you know, in the Bible and in the Quran, it's not that kind of thing. It's you know, bringing people back from the dead.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting though. With Muhammad, his miracles are, I mean, the main one is just the Quran itself. And so one thing that's said is that there are no more miracles. I mean, there's no more prophets, so like as a result, there's also no more miracles. But the Quran kind of is like a lasting miracle. Like that's supposed to be the one that stands the test of time from there on, you know. And so people kind of, you know, of course they take that in really goofy directions. They start kind of trying to talk about like mathematical miracles in the Quran and everything. I don't really buy into that kind of stuff, but some people really like it. But you know, we were talking about the memorization of Quran. Sometimes that's pointed to as one element to that, where, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have this book. Like it's a lengthy book, you know, it's not as long as the Bible, but it's a lot to memorize, you know, and yet people are able to do it. And so that's kind of pointed to as one element to that. But so Muhammad has a second miracle, which was only kind of something that would work in his lifetime, which is that he supposedly split the moon. And what's interesting to me is that from very early on, there were naturalistic explanations for it. Like Muslims themselves were not necessarily looking to see that as like he actually split the moon. I mean, that's the standard sort of explanation, right? Like it says he split the moon, so he split the moon. But scholars and you know, and theologians and stuff were more than willing to kind of go along with the idea that it appeared as though the moon was split. And that is interesting to me because I think it indicates what a miracle is. It's not, I kind of see it as you know, we have the laws of nature, laws of physics, all this kind of stuff where, and in Islam there's even like a kind of a concept for this stuff, which is like the sunnat Allah. So we have the sunnah of the prophet, there's sunnahs. This is a concept that predates Islam. A sunnah is like a way, it's like a habit or a lifestyle or something like that, and it goes down to the really fine details, especially with Muhammad. You know, we have like very specific things about what he did and how he did them, and we try to emulate that. With the Sunnat Allah, that's like the way that God acts in the world, how he kind of creates and recreates the world from moment to moment. So like we have the sun rises and it sets, and then we have the seasons, and you know, all the kind of laws of nature and all that, right? So a miracle is a break from that, and it's an intentional break, right? Like God changes his sunnah to do something, to demonstrate something. And so to me, it seems like it indicates the point of the miracle is to create some kind of meaning out of that. It's not just like an arbitrary random thing that just like, you know, like a random mutation of genetics or something like that. Yeah. There's a kind of almost like a spectacle or something that's being done there. So whether the moon actually split or not, that doesn't matter. What matters is that the people had this experience of seeing the moon split when, so Muhammad, he raises his staff. Like people are saying like, oh, if you're a prophet, show me, do something. And he says, what can I do? And the people say, split the moon. And so he just raises his staff, and then it appears as if the moon splits. So the fact that that happened and that those people were convinced by it, that's the miracle, right? That something changed in their hearts. And it's not like they were just like, oh, this guy has magic powers. Like something else happened. Like there was a deeper change. They realized that God is all powerful. A lot of these people, it's not that they didn't believe in God and they had to be convinced. It's more that they had to accept the fact that God is like all powerful in like the very, the profound sense that means from a monotheistic perspective. There aren't these minor deities that intervene for you. It's you and God. So yeah, I think that's kind of the meaning of miracles that I've come to, that makes a little more sense to me. So it doesn't actually matter what the naturalistic explanation is. What matters is the viewing experience of it, kind of.
That's funny, because I actually can't remember very much of Hume's argument, but Hume wrote a sort of a pamphlet on miracles, and one of his conclusions was that if you believe in miracles, you have to be aware that a miracle is occurring inside you. Just because the pattern, there's something where there's a sort of an empirical point here, which is we're shaped by the patterns of the world we live in.
Right.
Our notion of causality is shaped by our experiences. We really shouldn't have to think that something radically outside this could happen, to believe that there is some kind of, say, supernatural power at all, is kind of a miraculous occurrence in your own, which is not quite the point you were trying to make, I realize, but the emphasis on what's going on internally as opposed to what's going on externally it's interesting to think about it in those terms.
Yeah, there's a book that I haven't read, but our friend Mike has read it and recommended it, and I don't remember the name of it, but we'll throw it in the show notes here. And it deals with miracles. It was written very recently, like within the past 5-10 years or so, and it's got a very interesting take from what I understand. It kind of talks about the different miracles, and it explores what were they trying to say, and so it looks at like the virgin birth of Mary, which is a miracle that is in Islam as well as in Christianity. And it talks about the fact that it was a birth that was miraculous there. It's supposed to make us look at all births as miracles, as miraculous in some kind of way too. Like it's almost like pointing to like, look how amazing this is. It happened, outside of the norm, but that should make you consider the fact that kind of like every birth is miraculous and amazing in a way, So that's another idea that I find interesting.
I think it's a good one, because you hear a lot of stuff about God of the gaps, right? Which is an attempt to found a belief in God and things that science hasn't explained, which is a discussion that I just don't understand at all. It seems like a largely American thing. I don't know. I mean most. My understanding of religion is not of something where the supernatural beliefs. Religion is believing in just crazy supernatural stuff. I don't think that's ever been sort of the core of religion in any epoch. I mean, religions have them, but that sort of reflects the way people thought at the time. But there's I don't want to be a troll about it or anything, because I don't completely believe this, but there's a sort of a science of the gaps, right? Where, once you're engaged in this debate, you also have this idea that a lot of strange concepts we have are just going to be explained by science. And I think that's probably true, but the explanations for the origin of life, for instance, are, I'm always struck by how difficult scientific explanations for the origins of life, or even to find a sort of a clear definition of what life is, how difficult that is. There's I'm not saying that God explains it or anything like that, but there are gaps in our knowledge, not just our knowledge, but the concepts we have for getting knowledge in the first place. Because I feel in a lot of science began as philosophy. Philosophers would sharpen the concepts that people needed.
Yeah, natural philosophy, right?
Yeah. I mean, Hume thought he was doing something pretty much along the lines of Newton. Leibniz was trying to give he was trying to give arguments for God as well, around the same. He was thinking about philosophical ideas around the same time he was developing calculus, and he wouldn't necessarily have seen. He wouldn't have demarcated philosophy from science in the way that we do now.
Sure.
But I don't know. I guess I'm interested in the way that science and religion are thought to conflict. I don't really understand why. The view of religion that people have, which assumes there should be a conflict, seems quite wrong-headed.
I think that a lot of it is just like a simple sort of sociological, historical kind of look at it, where it's like, okay, people used to believe all these other things, like, different religions and things, and they were using it as a way of explaining things around them. And now that we know why those things are happening, like we know that the sun, the earth goes around the sun and the moon goes around the earth and stuff. Now that we know that the earth goes around the sun, we don't need the Bible or something like that kind of thing. Like, I think it is one of those ones where most of it ends up being kind of like a low level argument. Although at the same time, simple, that's kind of a trap in its own way, is that just because it's a simple argument doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just that's where I experience it the most. It's kind of that sort of like flippant way. Although I always think of that sometimes. It's like I bring it up sometimes, but there's this thing in the Christopher Guest movie A Mighty Wind. There's like members of like a cult that are like a singing community, but like they're members of cult. And there's this one member of the cult who's trying to explain why they're not a cult to the interviewer. And he's saying that, he goes, we're not some crazy kooky kind of belief system, all we believe is that, all human life is light operating on the 47th vibration or something like that. and he says it in such a way that is just like so obvious. That's what religion used to feel like to me all the time.
Yeah.
It's like you hear things like that where it's like, it's the same thing. It's like, I think that like if someone like say criticized Scientology or something like that, and you're like, I'm sure if you're a member of that or something, you would be like, oh, well, here comes the E-meter criticisms again. It's like,
But
there's something strange. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Religion is old, and it had to accommodate a lot of folk beliefs that people weren't necessarily prepared to get rid of. Like when you hear about the sort of the Catholic heresies, which were, knocking about the south of France, where good Catholics were worshiping, a dog they found and that kind of thing. It's
Sure.
it's I don't think there was anything unchristian necessarily about doing that. Although I mean, the religious authorities did decide that those people needed to be stamped out. But with Buddhism, when you look at the sort of the central claims of Buddhism, which is life to crave is to suffer. Craving is suffering, and you're like, okay, yep, that's great. I'm completely I feel like even if I don't necessarily want to adopt this as a religious truth in my worldview in the way that Buddhism wants me to, there's something sensible about this. But then you also get, there are 138 or 38,000 levels of hell, and you're like, well, I don't. Now that's where they lose me.
Sure.
But you want a view of religion where those claims, a lot of the crazy supernatural claims aren't the essence of the religion, if there is such a thing as an essence of a religion. But actually, Tom, in Islam, I mentioned that there were sort of folk beliefs, sort of pre-Christian folk beliefs that could hang around in the belief structure. Is there anything like that, do you think, in Islam? Where you'll hear an aspect of I don't know, a regional belief, and you think that sounds like it could have been a sort of a pre-Muhammad belief?
Well, kind of yes and no. I mean, honestly, some of the practices are the thing about it is there's certain, I wouldn't say beliefs, but like certain elements of the narrative and certain practices that are very self-consciously, like it's very understood that this does predate Islam, and that it's sort of like unashamedly kind of just taking from pre-Islamic practices and stories and stuff. So the Quran references events that were like recent history at the time, and that we wouldn't know about necessarily today, except for the fact that it's like part of the Islamic narrative. Like there's a reference to something that's like the War of the Elephants or the Battle of the Elephants or something like that. And it's like, well, I don't know what that is, but it was an event where these elephants were used as part of an invasion from Ethiopia into the the Hijaz, like where Mecca and everything is, and they were turned back by a bunch of birds that kind of just appeared and started dropping stones on the elephants for some reason. And this was something that it wasn't like a religious belief necessarily, but it was just something everyone knew about because it happened like 10 years ago, and it was like, oh wow, this is, it's in the Quran now, that's cool. So there's stuff like that, but then there's things like Hajj was something that was going on before Islam. It changed after Islam, like they kind of changed the way that it was done, but it was a big part of the practice of the pagan sort of lifeways and stuff there. People would bring their idols to the Kaaba, and it was a big like a trade hub, and that still it still is today as well. There's a kind of a funny anecdote that happens with the Prophet at one point. He's asked about this pre-Islamic ritual or this kind of festival that was going on where people would slaughter an animal and take the blood from the animal and like rub it all over themselves so they were just completely red. And that was, they would do something like there was some kind of, thing. I don't really know exactly the specifics, but he was asked like, is this okay to do? And he was like, no, we shouldn't really be doing that. And then someone was like, well, my son, like my young son, it really wants to do this and stuff. And he said, well, don't slaughter an animal. Just take these berries that kind of stain you red in the same way, and then you can do it. And that's okay. But, as long as you understand, like, you're not doing it as part of like a religious observance for some pagan god or something, it's okay. So there's things like that. And now that's not something that anyone does anymore. That was just like a very short-term sort of thing that I guess died off. But yeah, there's just kind of an acceptance of like, yeah, people have these practices, these beliefs. There's very important kind of rejections that are asked of people when they become Muslim, or even just like living in a Muslim land. Like there's certain things you kind of have to give up just to kind of like go along with things. But overall, I think there's a sort of a kind of an understanding that people just do things differently. I guess a lot of the early Muslims were from different places. There were people from East Africa. There were people from Persia. There were people from what at the time was like Byzantine Greece. So you had all kinds of different people with different ways of doing things, different ideas. And there was a kind of the central core that unified everybody, but a lot more like laxity once you kind of got outside that. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure.
Oh no, it gave me very sort of warm humanistic feelings. No, genuinely. Yeah. I guess that's the sort of the experience Malcolm X was supposed to have had, right? When he went on.
Yeah, I feel that way whenever I go to the mosque and there's people of all different shades, all different backgrounds. It's kind of a nice feeling. Like, be praying there, and there'll be a guy from Africa on my left, a guy from India on my right, an Arab in front of me. Like that's just Bosnian behind me. It's a nice feeling.
Yeah, it's better than nationalism, I think.
Yeah.
Religion is bad when it is infused with nationalism. That's when a lot of the but
well, yeah, I was joking about that with before about Catholicism sometimes, where they a lot of people online that are like trad-cath types or something like that, like are really into far right politics and stuff like that, and a lot of them are explicitly like white nationalist in different ways, maybe not saying that directly, but and I said, like, it's kind of funny that, like, if you go to an actual church in most major cities in the US, it's going to be like, people from Latin America, it's going to be Filipinos, it's going to be people from Africa, it's like, I'm like, what kind of, I know there are a lot of churches in the United States where that's not the case, where you're going to have very white congregations and stuff, but like, it's just funny that you kind of wonder what their experiences of the church are, especially if you look at like even just overall statistics of the church. I don't know. Now, at the same time, I know a lot of those parishioners might be right wing themselves. It's not like, it's not like you just are somehow have some, global humanistic kind of outlook just because you're from a different area or whatever. But like, I don't know. I just think that's kind of a funny thing about religion where, it's taken on this thing where a lot of people pull it into that direction. Before we get any further, I just want to double check. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that sort of like BBC documentary or that, experience of the Jesus and the dreams and things that, before we get too far away from that, just because we kind of went on a tangent.
It's a good tangent. But actually, no, there was one other thing which I found interesting. He said that I mentioned that he would, the prisoners, he and his fellow prisoners would mark time by listening to the birds. They knew if a certain guard was coming in, or they knew when a certain, if the guards were changing. They knew what time of year it was, all these things based on the bird song they could hear. But he said that they knew when someone was going to die because an owl would start hooting. An owl would fly into the prison courtyard and they could hear it. And they would always start discussing about who it was who was going. They would always start discussing who was going to die if they heard the owl. And the interviewer asked what his explanation was, why he thought that, what he thought about that, and he said he didn't have any explanation for it. And when I was listening to this, I was wondering. This was in the context of, formalized religious belief, and I suppose I was wondering if there was any, religious connotation to what he was saying, or if it was just a strange experience that he had. When you hear something like that, the explanations that you always want to give is that, well, his mind was going, or, it was a kind of a collective, it was a sort of, I don't know, a collective code. They sort of misunderstood. I don't know. They sort of collectively, subconsciously decided to interpret the owl like that and whatever. But I don't know. I don't really know what to think about that stuff. I suppose when I hear things like that, I have the attitude of those 19th century, like American and English scientists who were, open to the idea of seemingly supernatural events and would study them and that kind of thing. But it occurred to me that I don't know. There are some forms of Christianity where you would not want to say that the animals were communicating with you. That would be it's not that he thought that the owl was prophesying something, but that there are some people who would not be open to that idea because it's just sort of out of step with their religious commitments. And Tom, I know you've talked about animals in Islam before, I think, on an earlier episode, but I can't remember what you said. Is this something that would fit in with an Islamic worldview, if you can?
Yeah. So I've never heard anything about owls in particular. It's possible there's something in Morocco or North Africa more generally that they have something culturally like that. There's plenty of sort of beliefs that don't, percolate to like a universal level where someone like me would come to find about them, But so that's a possibility. I just don't know about it, but I've never heard anything. If I was going to take a kind of Muslim perspective on that and interpret that as like, very much in that vein, I think it's perfectly in line with like Islamic beliefs and everything to just view that as God sent this owl. That's doesn't have to be that that the owl is some sort of prophet or that doesn't kind of step. It doesn't cross any lines theologically speaking. God does all kinds of stuff all the time, and that's perfectly acceptable to kind of interpret that in that way. Same thing with the dreams. He's receiving these dreams. We would see that as God sending him these dreams. Whenever you see a prophet in a dream in Islam, that's what's called a true dream. So we talked about this a little bit on our episode about sleep and stuff. We talked about dream interpretation in Islam, which is It's a kind of a big thing traditionally, and prophets are people that can't be impersonated by jinn or by Satan. So if you see a prophet and you're like sure that you've seen a prophet in your dream, then you've really been visited by that prophet. And in Islam we also believe like when you dream, it's not just like a projection from your mind necessarily, that there are these things called true dreams, and they come from God through angels, and that you are in a real place. Like it's not like you've necessarily physically moved to a new location or something, but you are actually experiencing. That is a reality that you are experiencing.
That's interesting. I enjoyed that episode a lot because I found that discussion interesting, because it's, there's a lot of dreams you can't do any high readings of them. You couldn't do a religious reading, or you couldn't do like a symbolic Jungian reading or whatever. It's just it's just like crap in your head that's been floating around and it's come out. It's like the white noise. But there are some that you really remember, and you feel as though there's something more significant, and you want an explanation for it. And I like
that would be a true dream. Yeah.
And so Aziz bin had many true dreams, but it was brought on these dreams. He had so many of them clearly because he was in a very extreme situation. 18 years is it's tough to think about, and it's the fact that he, the dreams were such an important part of his getting through it. I don't know. I don't know what point I want to make about it. I just think it says something about the kind of animals we are and how we should relate to our, how our religious beliefs are important. It reminds me, there's a very beautiful English poem from the 14th century called The Pearl, which is in the tradition of English, I think a lot of English Christianity, or European Christianity from the Middle Ages. There was a lot of emphasis on dreams. A lot of religious writing came in the form of dream narratives. And the author of this poem, who's unknown, describes his daughter who died at the age of 2. And he falls asleep, and he dreams that he's walking past a river, and on the other side of the river he sees what is clearly heaven, but the dream is a very beautiful countryside, and he sees a woman on the other side of the river, and he recognizes her as his daughter that he'd lost. And this is where, and I think we're probably all very familiar with this experience. And the dream with a manifest content, a Freudian term, is a particular thing, but there's something deeper in our understanding which says, I know this is that person, or I know this. You know what I mean? I don't.
Sure.
I knew it was him, even though it didn't look like him. And he recognizes this woman as his daughter, and he sees that she's wearing a crown, and he says, I don't understand why you're wearing a crown. You were lowborn. And he says, Father, we are all kings and queens in heaven. And it's not just a way of dealing. This isn't just a dream about death. It's coping with death in Christian doctrine, which is presenting what I think you could describe as a very sort of egalitarian vision of heaven, despite the fact that they're using the titles of feudalism or whatever.
Sure.
Hotep heaven, really.
But that's the religious dreams when you're dealing with grief. There's always there's a temptation, I think, to say, well, a lot of religious belief is irrational because really it's just a way of making yourself feel better about death or about grief or whatever. But this always seems sort of contradictory to me, because one of the points of a religion is to help people deal with aspects of the bad aspects of a human life, which all people are subjected to: loss, grief, one's death. And to me, it always feels like, religion's helping you cope with death or loss. It means their central sort of claims should be rubbished because they're clearly performing the psychological function. But these sorts of functional dismissals just seem stupid, because that seems to me to be the point of religion. There's no way you could make it doesn't seem like a good basis for an atheistic argument, but a lot of people seem to want to make it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with your objections. I wouldn't call that the point of religion, though. I think that people kind of, maybe that's a cultural thing or something that's from their experience with religion, but I think that there's a lot of positivity. Like, there's a lot of, religion also touches on a lot of the positive parts of life just as much.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it seems a little bit odd to kind of cast it as like, oh, it's just a rationalization to help you kind of get through the bad things.
Well, getting through the bad things is one of the things that religion is meant to do. It's by its own lights, but it's also a framework for the good aspect. Yeah, I didn't want to say it was just concerned with the bad things, but of course, there's a point there where descriptions of hell are always very, very vivid. In any culture, when you think about it, there's people's imaginations go crazy. Heaven's always harder. It seems harder to describe. Sometimes it just seems really boring. English, like Anglican visions of heaven, it's like having tea in a waiting room almost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always like the verse in the Quran that talks about people in paradise kind of just hanging out. They're eating fruit, and then they'll say to each other, "Oh, we used to have something like this before. We used to eat fruit, and it was, fruit was great, right? It was nice and sweet and perfectly ripe and all this kind of stuff. But it's not exactly the same. There's a fundamental difference in the realities. It's just a completely different sort of like dimension or something.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, you get there's these pleasure experiences in paradise, just as there were in this world, so I don't know, I've always liked that, just to imagine these people hanging out. That's not having a peach.
You got to have someone to talk to. If you have a depiction of heaven where you're just sort of standing around and singing and not conversing with someone, that doesn't seem that great to me. But the funniest, the best, my favorite, one of the favorite accounts of heaven and hell that I heard was Tertullian, and he was writing something. He was trying to encourage Christians. This was sort of the very late antiquity. He was encouraging Christians not to go to the circus to look at the performers. He said, because you'll have plenty of time for that in heaven, because when you go to heaven, you'll see all the actors and the acrobats in hell, and the acrobats will be jumping much higher and much more nimbly, and the tragic actors will be bellowing much more realistically, because they'll be tormented by the flames of hell. And what's more, God wants you to enjoy watching them suffer, because He made them suffer, and if you don't enjoy it, you're not doing the will of God, because you're going against God's will.
Sure.
Wow.
I just wanted to, another thing it's sort of an obvious point, but it's just, I think it's important for the discussion. It's kind of, is that it's true that, like, the sort of dealing with things like loss and grief and all these things, that's like an aspect of religion. And you can kind of have like these debates, which again, kind of are sort of sociological. It's like, or psychological or something, where it's like, what is the psychological benefit of these sort of debates or something. But again, it's hard to say it's like the point of religion, because in the sense, like, the religion itself, if it's true on its own merits, it's fidelity to God and sort of fidelity to the real actual thing, right? It's not like a story which is consoling. It's also just an actual reality that you're part of, that is important to think. I think that sometimes becomes part of the problem with the debate, when it's like trying to hash through the benefits and negatives of religion from the assumption that it's not true. You know what I mean? Like, that's what a lot of the debates end up having to do with. And I can understand that, especially if it's like from, say, a Marxist perspective or something, where it's like, it's all religions are basically sort of folk tales that, you kind of have to weed out eventually, because or have to have some sort of accommodation with, where they just force people into making these bizarre decisions and have strange loyalties and all that. But it's also important to just, that's not how the religion kind of sees it. That's
absolutely. It's like, you can contrast, say, the sociological description of Jesus, which is, you can contrast, say, Son of God with charismatic figurehead of guilt-based religion. The differing attitudes there are not just, troubling to, say, a Christian person, but anyone who has a similar figurehead. And I agree with that. I mean, I have to think about this myself because I'm doing philosophy about religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, the best conception that I've been able to have, to develop, which isn't, I think, the predominant one in philosophy of religion, which is really, it just takes the Abrahamic religions as the main subject, and you're analyzing the evidence for belief in an all powerful, personal God. But I think I find it more helpful thinking about religion from a normative point of view, which is, you acknowledge the fact that one of the things that religion does, it gives you a total reaction on the world. It orients you to reality in a particular way, and and that particular way being quite total. And because it does this, or it performs a sort of orienting function, and I think you can talk about it in terms of a function, then it's apt for ethical, I think, rather than empirical or sociological or epistemic analysis or any of those things. So you want an ideal of religion which you can judge religions against. I mean, this is what I think the point of philosophy of religion should really be. But when you think about what it is that the role that religion performs, if you want to give an actually helpful description of it, it would be something like it not only sets out what high religious ideals are, and sort of systematizes them or gives you a framework of thinking about them. It also, one of the points, I think, is to sustain a commitment to those ideals, even if the world looks as though those, the world goes against the grain of those ideals, if you know what I mean. We have high ideals. Evil seems to be a very prevalent and entrenched thing. How do you sustain a commitment to high ideals in the face of, in particularly, of evil? And so I think one of the most important things religions do is it gives you a way of sustaining a commitment. And now, if you're analyzing religion on those terms, you are not doing the sociological thing where you're saying, oh, it's just performing this function. You can actually take religion at face value. You can you can assess their central claims. It's not, because the problem is not just saying, oh, they're right or wrong. It's that point you made, exactly that point you made, Don, which is there's almost an assumption that you're not committed, that they're not true, that you're not committed to them. Well, with this kind of normative approach, which I think is better, you're not falling into that trap, which is why I kind of like it. But it also, so the high ideals that religion is supposed to commit you to, which I imagine as being central to religion. I mean, there's no need to try and even cast those ideals in a purely naturalistic way. Although I think you could, without undercutting belief in God or anything like that. But see, I mean, for me, the high ideals that I would gain if I was a good Christian and not an extremely bad one. I don't necessarily see them as having any supernatural origin, but I do think they're revealed. I think I do think about Jesus as having revealed something that humanity didn't really know before. I can't say exactly what it is, but I think there are revealed goods in religion which go beyond conventional understandings of ethics. But you can still discuss them in a sort of a philosophical, as opposed to, say, a theological way. I personally with me, I favor, my superego favors naturalistic explanations, although my lower, the deeper, darker part of my mind still very strongly believes in the supernatural. But so, I think my intellectual project is almost trying to dig God out of the soil, as opposed to sort of looking at, finding him in some emergent property of physical matter. I don't know. It's hard. It's religion. I don't know. Religion does my head in. Sorry, did any of that make sense?
Yeah.
Sure.
I agree with a lot of what you were saying.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Because about when I was trying to get those ideas out, there was 10 seconds in where I thought, man, this could be, this may be just completely incomprehensible bullshit, but it's too late now.
Yeah, that's me. Like every episode we do of this show.
No, well, as a long-time listener, I can tell you, I've never had that. I've always listened very intently to everything both of you have to say.
Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's nice, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a thought, about this sort of like scientific perspective on religion and the view of it as like a rationalization and all that. And I was just thinking like the things that it views as rationalizations that religion performs, like explanations for death and kind of providing for justice where there seems to be none and all this kind of thing. It seems like it's all of the things that a scientific kind of worldview cannot provide. And so if somebody else is providing that, I don't know if it's like seen as threatening or something, but it seems like that's not fair. You can't do that. That's obviously false because my worldview doesn't have that. If you kind of just have a very base kind of materialistic view of the world where people are born and they die and that's it, there's no kind of deeper meaning to it than that, then there is no real justice except maybe like happy accidents here and there. Like things are just kind of shitty all the time for most people. And so if you have some kind of narrative that provides a little bit more of an optimistic, hopeful kind of thing that like, oh, things are set right in the afterlife and all that seems like cheating or something, So I don't know. I was just wondering what you guys thought about that.
Oh man. Yeah, I don't know. I struggle with this thought a lot. I don't really know what to say. I don't think you necessarily need an afterlife. I mean, I think part of it definitely involves having to adjust your thinking to injustices in this life. I mean, even if claims about the afterlife of a particular kind were true, I don't know if that should necessarily make us feel better about injustices in this life. But
oh yeah, absolutely. Like, one of, I think both in Christianity and Islam is that you have to work for that. You have to try to make this place better, even though it's by design pretty bad for most people all the time.
What do you think?
Like,
Don, what do you think of? I don't know if you came across actually, Tom, what do you think of this? Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is among you," and I mean that seems to me to suggest that you ought to be trying to bring about conditions of justice, or you say even perfect justice between people in this life. It's sort of an admonition. Don't think that justice or ideal human flourishing is out there. I think this is something that you could probably talk about, Tom, even if you don't accept that Jesus was really the true herald of the kingdom of heaven, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I don't fully understand exactly what what that term means for Christians. I that's not something I really know about exactly. But just on first glance, I completely agree with that. Like, one of the things with both our religions is that there's Judgment Day. So you are judged based on your life. Like, how did you spend your life? Did you spend it just sort of like dismissing every bad thing that you saw and were just kind of like, well, this is all just kind of like a temporary place, and then I'm going to die and go to heaven anyway, so this is all, doesn't really bother me, who cares, what's in it for me to kind of do anything here? Well, no, there's like a judgment on what you did, right? So all these bad things are happening because it's like an opportunity, buy the dip, go out there and try and fix things, like you'll be judged on that and rewarded if you're doing the right thing, so yeah, 100% don't. The whole idea of like religion is just there to kind of like paper over this stuff and make things kind of stand for the status quo. That has happened, but I don't think we can say that that's like an inherent part of religion at its core. It's gone the opposite way just as many times.
I think that one thing on this though is that I do think it's true that I don't know if it's that sort of statement and that sort of thinking is more. I don't really think it's about instantiating a certain egalitarian outcome in the status quo. I mean, like in the here and now or something like that, as it's not the possibility of that that's the focus as much as the approach of the person and the people in the Christian community to the present or something like that. Like where it's like it's saying you have the responsibility and the almost like gift, like the ability to approach helping others and building some sort of unity and sort of egalitarian outlook and things in your present. But I don't think that it's necessarily. I don't think there's like a 1-to-1 correlation with it being the expected outcome of politics. It's not like it doesn't mean that means that that there's somehow everyone that hears that has to become basically like a communist or something like that, like out of that basic statement or something like that. I think people can maybe argue either way if that's true, how you get to that conclusion or something. But I think it's more a matter of it's basically, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's the same basic message. It's the same idea of like your work is not basically just to ignore everyone else in your society and just focus like with blinders on of I'm a member of the elect and I have to kind of just keep my focus on that. But I think at the same time, it's interesting because one of the problems I sort of think about this kind of stuff about, like sex and relationships and things like that is somewhere where this kind of stuff actually comes up a lot pretty quickly because in the modern Catholic Church, because, there has to be a lot of different ways of living the religion. Like there just has to be, because if you look at things like celibacy or something, right? Like it's like, which in the Christian religion has relationships with justice and things like that, right? So it has to be true in the Christian religion that certain ways of living celibate lives is saintly or something like that, right? Like it can't just be the case that like that is all that. There's so many examples of the saints and stuff throughout history and all that where it can't be true that like that's just a wrong thing or something like that, right? Now the problem is that the Catholic Church builds a lot of things on top of that, where they turn that certain types of examples into perfection, into lots of different types of people should be doing certain things and things like that, which basically like I'm just trying to get at the point that like when you hear things about like you should be helping others and things like that, or like you should be trying to instantiate a certain type of community. And the thing, I think a lot of times, especially for me, I'll hear a certain type of way of life and, assume that basically it's like reinforcing what I already believe about certain things, about like, we should be trying to build this kind of community, socialist community or whatever. And I think to myself that like, that's probably not the case. There's people that lived as like hermits that went off basically by themselves and did, just prayed all the time and things like that. And there's other people that feel like they have to be engaged every day with healing the poor and things like that. Like it has to be something where it's like your personal call from the religion does not necessarily turn it into everyone acting the same way or something.
Yeah, it's a very modern way of thinking, almost, where you've got to have rules. You need to legislate, and you need to legislate on behalf of everyone. You get that in...
Yeah.
This was actually Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a Catholic philosopher, her criticism of Kant. She accused him of getting caught up in the fad of legislating, where morality is your reason legislates a moral principle on just behalf of everyone. That's probably not exactly, when you say the Catholic Church built a lot of stuff into that, I guess that's not really necessarily what's going on, but it's what it reminded me of, because I guess the basic point is people's life circumstances are various, and rules cannot be too fine-grained, if you know what I mean. Someone wants to... It's like if you had a very, very strict idea of what a monk was meant to do, and I suppose some I have very, very strict ideas to develop, but then about being getting away from the world, but then you also had the Irish monastic tradition, which was just like walking around trying to convert people, and possibly getting killed. And then you think about the when you were talking about celibacy, that's a good life for one person, but it's not necessarily a good life for another person in relation to religious conviction. Some people thought being saintly, or their religious calling was sitting on top of a big pillar, You know,
Yeah.
the stylites.
Right.
That's,
Stylites,
you know,
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
and just never coming down. That's the stuff that I remember being fascinated by that when I heard about it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it's funny because these things came up. I mean, they came up throughout the history of the, sort of like Jewish tradition and things, and other, historical sorts of faiths and stuff. But like in the Christian religion, that. I mean, that is basically the last part of the Bible, is just all of these debates coming to life, kind of thing, of people. I mean, first in Jesus's actual life, I guess, like him kind of dealing with all the people that are saying, trying to catch him on different points, and trying to like correct different points and stuff. But then you've got like a whole thing of like, like, are we going to have to get circumcised now or something like that? All that kind of stuff. And I don't know. I think it does come up pretty quickly with any sort of thing. That kind of, that problem of, what kind of diversity can you accept in something that's supposed to be the revealed truth or something. So
it's a long-standing problem, but it's interesting.
Yeah, that's a kind of a big issue for Islam these days, I think. I mean, I feel like once this kind of like mentality of modernity kind of crept into Muslim societies, it like hit the mother lode. Like you found this tradition of legalism that's just like so expansive. It's like, oh, we can make a rule out of everything.
Yeah.
And like traditionally, historically, these rules existed. Yes, people followed them and everything. But it's also important to understand, like, these laws were never codified. Like, through the entire history of Islam, there was no attempt to codify them until like the last 50 years of the Ottoman Empire. It was when they finally started to do that, because they were kind of jumping on board with the whole modernization wagon. So it was always kind of applied by a person who, it wasn't just like they had technical knowledge of the law. They were also trained and disciplined in a kind of ethical sense. Their character was also cultivated, so they would be able to apply these laws in a way that was just according to the circumstances. So they would have an understanding of like what makes sense here. All the rulings and everything on the Sharia they're derived from specific occurrences of like, well, does this actually apply? It's very conditional. It's not just like, this is the rule that can be arrived at through like logical kind of, working that out, and then it just has to be done this exact way with no discussion. That's never how it worked previously. Nowadays, everyone just Googles something and finds out like some guy in Saudi Arabia said this, and this is how we have to do it, and that's it. That's like the end of the discussion. So I think that's been a pretty bad thing. People like to blame like Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi kind of evangelism and everything, and I'm no fan of that. I think that's a bad thing. But I think just as much, just the way that we think about this stuff is to blame. It's not just some kind of like Saudi conspiracy. It's also just we think about these things in a kind of a not a productive way. Like, it's not the way that people used to think about them and applied them productively in their lives.
And there's also a weird impetus, I think, to just make rules more and more and more sort of specific and detailed. I mean, it depends on the context. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be in sort of secular legal context. Criminal law is going to be very different from, I don't know, tort law, property law, that kind of thing. But there is, particularly if you're thinking about morality in a legalistic sense. You want to get very, very fine-grained principles. And actually, G.A. Cohen, who we were talking about before recording, but the Canadian sort of quasi-Marxist philosopher, he was arguing against some Rawlsians who were suggesting that the rules of justice must be public, and they also need to be quite fine-grained. But he pointed out that very fine-grained rules become tyrannous, especially when it relates to things like distributive justice or other forms of justice, because if you have very fine-grained rules, it's that they will apply to your actions just in the most insane way. It becomes a form of control, and that's not how humans don't flourish if they're
No.
bound by very, very fine-grained rules. And this is, with a lot of the, I don't want to say wokeness or identity pop, but in a lot of like online based moral discourse, and I think this stuff is basically just online, because a lot of the stuff people say there, I just can't imagine people making these points to another person's face. It would be, you'd feel almost embarrassed to
Sure.
for instance, an example would be, you're not allowed to ask taxi drivers where they're from, would be an example of a very
Yeah.
fine grained
Yeah.
rules, because that's a microaggression. The
Yeah.
microaggression stuff is, I don't want to be a person who complains about this stuff. I just think it's an interesting example
Sure.
of rules becoming very, very fine grained.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that while you were saying that. I was like, I want to bring up maybe this sort of stuff that's going on online, but I don't really know if maybe people would accept that sort of transition in the conversation. But yeah, I mean, we both thought the same thing, I guess. Where
Yeah.
we were talking about this with Felix last week, where we were saying that, like, I don't know, it does seem like there's this I don't know what it is, but it's like a renegotiation or like a new debate. Maybe this happens all throughout history. I don't know, but like where there seems like there's like a set of people that are developing new sort of morals. I don't know if morals is the word, but like terms of politeness or something, manners, I guess. But like, it's around these things. And I don't know if that process is necessarily bad in itself. Like, it's just a natural sort of thing. You're going to have that kind of thing, especially as attitudes towards things like racism and sexism change and things in different ways and take on new meanings and all that. But like, that's just kind of a process that's happening. And the difference is, though, I think that like, you do get this process where people are trying to establish new rules that don't cohere with the old, more loose rules about certain things. And then that process ends up constantly exploding in different ways, right? Like where people will be trapped in contradictions in their logic and stuff, and it's because it hasn't been ironed out yet, really. I mean, if it's ever ironed out, I don't know, but like you can kind of see that process in real time now, where there's people who seem shockingly confident about certain things being out of bounds, and then other people that just have no idea what you're talking about. It's not even like that there's a debate. It's like, as you said, like the idea of not asking a cab driver just wouldn't even occur to someone that would be a thing.
Yeah.
Now, that might be a type of ignorance, but it's still like that's a change in morality or something. So, yeah.
It's odd. There's a lot of, it's working out. So much of it, especially when it's online, which is a sort of an arena for, venting emotional dysfunction in a way that allows you to interpret it as this, you're in your id. When a lot of these discussions, you're in the deepest, darkest pits of your id, but the story you're telling yourself is that you're in this platonic form of like perfect justice.
Sure.
And that's a lot of the mistake. The social aspect of it is interesting. I mean, here's one way I understand the way a lot of moral language, because I think it's moral language. I don't quite want to call it morality sometimes, or ethics. I mean, they are what you could call moral rules, but there's I think part of it can be explained by analogy to I was listening to an historian describe some research she'd been doing on hygiene practices in the United States, and she was talking about how hygiene practices developed in America and Europe in the sort of the mid 19th century. There was an emerging middle class, and they weren't aristocrats. They didn't have title, they didn't have land, but they needed class markers. They needed to distinguish themselves because they weren't proletarians. They weren't they weren't low, and they needed something to establish themselves as a sort of a social class. And one of the things that they sort of collectively seized on was hygiene practices. So bathing 3 times a day, and associated things. Now, part of this is because there was an explosion of scientific knowledge around in the area of health and hygiene. So it was a new body of knowledge which allowed for new forms of sort of social practices. But because it was being used, and I think empirically it makes sense to say that it was, hygiene practices did take on this sort of social class class function, you had a lot of sort of weird ideas built up on top of it. So one of them would be, there was this idea that the whiter a bar of soap was, the cleaner it would be. And this is not something that makes a lot of sense, but its symbolic value was important for the function that hygiene practices were serving. And of course, if you were a poor person and you had a doctor or a lawyer looking down their noses at you, you disgusting prole, the antagonism inherent in that kind of interaction, the person on the receiving end of that snobbishness might be inclined to say, well, it's all bullshit, it's
right.
That's the emotional temptation. And I think something similar is going on with a lot of the that particular kind of moralizing. But what I think why I think this analogy might be useful is because you can agree completely that the middle class hygiene practices were really, really, really annoying. But that doesn't mean hygiene itself. Some of the basic claims of hygiene are wrong. So
sure.
With the identity, and I think this is the mistake a lot of the people make. They're irritated. They're so deeply irritated by the discourse that they become emotionally invested in just destroying it, root and stem.
Yeah, that's something that the Brunigs talk about a lot on their podcast, about like polarization, sort of driving people to pick one side in an argument which isn't necessarily right, but sort of represents everything that they, it's the opposite of what they dislike in the other side of it, or something like that kind of thing. And that happens constantly in sort of these microcultures online and stuff, where you see people who, you could just basically almost ask them their assumptions of how politics works in different countries or something, or different sort of milieus, and they, you can kind of tell that they would have no idea. Like maybe something like, everyone hates Elon Musk or something like that. You could say something like that. Everyone hates Elon Musk. Well, it's not true, because most people either don't know who he is or have maybe some weird positive kind of thing about him or something like that, right? But like within their milieu online, everyone hates Elon Musk, and you can make that kind of joke about it or something. That happens constantly with different things, I think. And how people position their debates or arguments and stuff really, really ends up, to me, I noticed it a lot with like debates about China or something, where a lot of people have this idea now that the overarching sort of feeling is that China is the big enemy or something like that kind of thing. So then they have to take the other side of that argument basically and say, well, no, we accept, large swaths of the official Chinese ideology as a strategy of critiquing that drive to war or something like that kind of thing. And it's like you get stuck in that subculture or something like that. And I think that that's just a natural sort of ideological thing. But it is one of those things where if you don't pull yourself out of that sort of cul-de-sac, I think a lot of times throughout your day even, you're gonna get yourself in weird positions.
Oh yeah. It's almost like staring into the void. There's a moment where you realize that you could spend your day and potentially, the rest of your life getting, caught up in this stuff. And it's like you either step back from the void or you don't. But actually, I thought, Tom, I remember you talking about the sort of the way prayer functions your day in a really structures your day in a really helpful way. And I was thinking that, if you have to pray at a particular time of day, that's going to get you offline at a particular point. Maybe, you know what I mean? It's helpful.
Sure.
It's one of those things that it makes your life better. So, I mean, the point of prayer is obviously worshiping God, but it does make your life better in other ways, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
I actually mentioned this. I was talking to I was reminded when I was talking about taxi drivers earlier. I was talking to a taxi driver, and I mentioned that someone I knew had made this comment about prayer because we were talking about religion, and I was referring to the helpful aspects of prayer. We had a real nice chat,
Oh, cool.
and as I was getting out, he said, if we don't meet again in this life, we'll meet again on Judgment Day. And then he gave me his card.
Yeah.
Which is
That's nice.
very, I think about that and feel good.
Sure.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, why don't we wrap it up there? Unless, do you have anything else you wanted to add, or is that you feel
I
don't know.
No, I think we covered just about everything.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Well, it was great to have you on. It was nice chatting.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Is there anything, Tom, you wanted to add? Or?
No, yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, all right, guys, if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like a second episode of You Can't Win every week, you can subscribe to our Patreon, and for $5, you'll have that, as well as access to our Discord, where you can chat with us and our lovely community. If you want to send us questions, which I promise we will get back to answering at the end of these episodes, you can go to the Twitter account at You Can't Win Pod, and you'll find a link to our Curious Cat there, where you can send them in anonymously. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.
Bye, guys. Stop.